Hello, everybody, and welcome. Another episode in this series. My name is Mark, talking about Magic and another commander deck from one of the players in our LGS. Um, the name of the deck is Gitrog Gitfrog Fun Time. And the commander of this deck is the Gitrog Monster. So this is a 6/6 frog horror. It costs 3, a black and a green. It has Death Touch. And at the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice the Gitrog Monster unless you sacrifice a land. And then it says you may put an additional land, or you may play an additional land on each of your turns. And then it says, whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. So, the frog is eating our lands every turn, but he's also letting us play an additional land every turn. And then whenever lands go to our graveyard, we get to draw a card, which is going to happen when we sacrifice a land. So every turn, we should be drawing at least 2 cards. So, I think a lot of people would look at a deck like this and they would see this 6/6 death touching creature for 5 mana and think maybe this creature is supposed to win the game for us. Maybe this is how we do things. Maybe we attack people with a giant, scary, terrifying frog. I mean, look at the artwork. The thing's got an arm hanging out of its mouth. You know, I mean, we can surmise what might have happened there. As far as the deck itself, there are not that many commanders or legendary creatures that people play as commanders. There are not that many who are talking about lands. I mean, there are some for sure, but there aren't a huge amount. And a lot of the quote-unquote lands matter decks are playing a lot of lands. You know, if we say that, you know, the typical sort of casual or casual adjacent commander deck is playing like, you know, 35 to 38 lands or something like that. The lands matter deck a lot of times might be playing 40 or more. And this particular deck is playing 33. And one of the reasons why I think that's the case is because this is really not a win with combat type of a deck. Now, again, this is another one of those situations where it's like, but Mark, there are 27 creatures in this deck. Are you sure that we're not trying to win by combat? Well, to that I say we're playing a card like Azusa Lost But Seeking. It says you may play 2 additional lands in each of your turns. But it's a 1/2 for 3 mana. We're playing this Elysian Caryatid. It's a 2 mana dork. You know, we have a couple of other mana dorks here. We got Paradise Druid, we got Llanowar Elves. We have Poison Dart Frog, which I gotta be honest, I'm like 98% sure that this card is in here specifically because it's thematic with our frog-loving pilot of this deck. It's playing a card like Skola Grove Dancer, where whenever a land is put into your graveyard from anywhere, you gain a life. Then you can pay 3 2 and a green, I guess, to put the top card of your library in your graveyard. It's playing on a 3-mana dork. It's playing all of these cards that care about lands. There's almost no creatures in here that are big, heavy hitter type creatures. And so that's why I'm saying I think that a lot of this deck is not really trying to win with combat. A lot of these creatures are just sort of role players, and they're kind of just little guys trying to do, specific things, not so much trying to attack our opponent to win the game. And so okay, but Mark, we see a lot of decks that play littler creatures, but then they end up using combat to win. Well, that's because they augment their creatures with, equipments or some kind of buffs or whatever. And, as you look through the rest of the cards in this deck, there's really not a lot of cards that do that. We have a bunch of our lands, like our artifacts. We got the classic Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, but then you have the Allspark, which is doubling mana. You got your protection ones like Swiftfoot Boots and Whisper Silk Cloak. And then you got a card like Zuran Orb, which says you can sacrifice a land to gain 2 life. So here again, we're talking about putting our lands in the graveyard. And then you look at like a bunch of the spells. This one's getting cards back out of our graveyard. Okay. Gaia's Blessing. We're going to come back to that one. Life from the Loam gets lands back out of our graveyard. Rise of the Dark Realms gets creatures back out of the graveyard. Everybody's, but creatures out of the graveyard. Summer Bloom is playing more land. Sylvan Scrying is looking for a specific land. Kodama's Reach, finding lands out of our library. Farseek, Explore, Cultivate. These are all add more lands. Search our library for lands. Even the creatures, Wood Elves, going and finding lands. Sakura Tribe Elder, going and finding lands. Ramanop Excavator, playing lands out of our graveyard. So, Cursor of Krufix, we can play a land off the top of our library. So we have all of these cards that care about lands. We have Crop Rotation, sacrifice a land, go put any land into play from your library. Search your library for it. Rolling Regrowth finds land. So, and you got an enchantment like Spelunking that says, whatever enemy's battlefield, draw a card, then you may put a land card from your hand on the battlefield. And then it talks about a cave. If you have a cave, then you gain 4 life. That's not probably what we really care about with this deck. And then it says, lands you control enter the battlefield untapped. All these cards that care about lands. Which, again, our commander is a land-based... A land is the plan commander. So, how are we trying to win with a deck like this? Well, I'm going to tell you right now, and whenever we talk about a deck that is looking at playing combos, a lot of the time the combos are relatively straightforward. A lot of the times it's just kind of a 2-card combo, and bam, we got there. This particular deck, it is the ways that you can combo with this deck. There's a few, and I would need a elaborate graphic, I think, to try and explain a couple of these potential combos. So the first thing that I want to point at here, so Golgari Grave Troll, I just want to point at this card for a second. At the bottom of this card, it says that it has Dredge 6. So we've talked about this in another video, but what Dredge means is if you would draw a card, you can, instead of drawing that card, you can bring this card back to your hand from the graveyard, and then you would mill the number of cards that are in its dredge. So this one you would mill 6 cards. Okay. So why does that matter? Well, the Gitrog Monster, the last line in it, it says, whenever one or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, draw a card. So that means if I mill lands when I'm doing the dredge ability, those will cause the Gitrog Monster to the last part to trigger, and it will put a trigger to draw a card on the stack. So, one of the key cards to this deck is this card, Dakmor Salvage. Dakmor Salvage is a land. It says it enters the battlefield tapped, and then you can tap it to add a black mana to your mana pool. However, this land has Dredge 2. So, there are a handful of ways to take advantage of the fact that we have a land card that has Dredge. For starters, if the Gitrog Monster is in play and this card goes to the graveyard from anywhere, we mill it, we discard it, we sacrifice it, whatever, we're going to create a draw trigger. And that draw trigger can be replaced by the dredge on Dakmor Salvage to bring it back to our hand. And we mill 2 cards. How does this matter to us? Okay. Well, like I said, if we would have the ability to discard this card, well, over here we have a card, Ayula's Influence. It's triple green enchantment. It says discard a land card, create a 2/2 green bear creature token. So we could discard, assuming that we have Gitrog Monster in play, we could discard our Dakmor Salvage which then creates a draw trigger from Gitrog. So we get a 2/2 bear, we create a draw trigger. The Dakmor Salvage is now in our graveyard, so we can dredge 2 cards from our library, and we can get it back into our hand, right? Then we can discard it to Ayula's Influence again to get another 2/2 bear, create a draw trigger, and replace it with Dakmor Salvage by dredging back Dakmor Salvage. So this is sort of repeatable up until the number of cards in our library, right? If we had 64 cards left in our library, then that would kind of tell us, oh, we can only dredge using this 32 times before we run out of cards. Well, how do we fight against that? So here we talked about Gaia's Blessing earlier, and we're going to come back around to this card now. It's a 1 and a green sorcery. It says target player shuffles up to 3 target cards from their graveyard into their library, and then draw a card. So if that was all that the card was, it doesn't seem like it's that. It kind of seems pretty harmless. But it has this last line of text that says, when Gaia's Blessing is put into your graveyard from your library, shuffle your graveyard into your library. So if we have Gitrog Monster, and we have Ayula's Influence, and we have Dakmor Salvage, we can now, in theory, discard Dakmor Salvage, make a bear, dredge 2 cards off of our deck to get Dakmor Salvage back, rinse and repeat. Well, eventually we will run into this Gaia's Blessing, assuming that we don't have it in our hand or it hasn't been exiled. As long as it's in our library and we're never actually drawing cards off of our library, the Gaia's Blessing will just shuffle everything back and we can keep repeating the process. So now I'm going to talk about why this gets very, very tricky and very, very challenging. When we are busy milling cards off the top of our library with Dakmor Salvage to get it back and repeat this process, some of the cards that we mill are going to be lands. And those lands going to the graveyard create more draw triggers. Okay? So, I mean, the problem is with just these cards, we don't actually get to the end of anything. Yes, we can make this colossal number of bears, but we end up with a whole bunch of draw triggers, and we can't really get out of the loop. We either eventually draw more cards than are in our deck and we lose to that, or we need to have some way to replace those draws effects with something that doesn't keep milling our lands into our graveyard and causing more Gitrog Monster triggers. So we've already talked about Ayula's Influence, Dakmor Salvage, Gitrog Monster. That's 3-card combo. Guy's Blessing just has to be in the library. So in some ways, 4-card combo. But even that combo doesn't get us to the end of what we're doing. We need a way to replace the draw triggers. How do we accomplish that? Okay, we have this card Oblivion Crown. It says it has flash, it's an enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature has discard a card. This creature gets +1/+1 till end of turn. Right? So, one of the things that we can do is we can get to a situation where we don't have any more cards in our library. If we have Vigor in our hand, Vigor is a 3 and 3 green creature. It's a 6/6. And we're going to talk about the part of the text on this card that matters. It says, when Vigor is put into a graveyard from anywhere, shuffle it into its owner's library. So one of the things that we can do is if we end up with Vigor in our hand, we can use the Oblivion Crown. We can mill until we have no cards in our library, or until maybe we've started to use the draw triggers and we drew our Gaia's Blessing. So now we need a way out of the stack of draw triggers. The Oblivion Crown would allow us to discard the Vigor over and over and over. Discard it, it gets shuffled back in, you draw it, then you discard it, you shuffle it back in, then you draw it, then you discard it, you shuffle it back in, so on and so forth. And that can get rid of all of your draw triggers. Okay? That's one way. One other thing that we can do is we can just win the game with all of those draw triggers stacked up there. How do we do that? Well, we do our Gitrog Monster, Ayula's Influence, Dakmor Salvage loop, and that creates a whole bunch of 2/2 bears. And we could have out Mirkwood Bats. It says whenever you create or sacrifice a token, each opponent loses 1 life. So every time we make one of those bears, the Mirkwood Bats causes our opponents to lose 1 life. So now, even if we have 1,000 draw triggers stacked up waiting to resolve and potentially kill us, we don't have to worry about that because the Mirkwood Bats drained our opponents out of the game. But I want to go back to this. That's Gitrog Monster plus Ayula's Influence plus Dakmor Salvage plus Mirkwood Bats. It's 4 cards to achieve this goal. And if you're at this point now in this video where you're thinking, this is so confusing, this is so much, why can't I just have a 2-card combo? You can, but not if you want to do the thing that we're trying to do with the frog. This thing is absolutely wild. And it is one of the most complicated combos you'll ever see. There are certain, I mean, this is, in a lot of ways, this is actually kind of a budget build of this deck because, we're playing Diabolic Tutor, which is sort of a budget version of Demonic Tutor, there are other cards that care about tokens entering the battlefield, and we're not necessarily playing those. We're playing Poison Dart Frog and Spore Frog because these are meme type cards. So again, there's lots of other. I mean, I'm not even covering every single combo that's in this deck. There are more. I mean, I'm imagining that you can combo with Zuranorb, and you can create kind of a loop with that in some situations. Um, we do have Vampiric Tutor to go and find different pieces of our combo because that card allows us to search for any card. Um, this to me is one of those decks where if you pull this off, it's like the super elaborate mousetrap, the Rube Goldberg machine. I've said this so many times. If you pull this off, your opponents might be sitting there scratching their head a little bit, like, what did you just do? How did you even just do this? Can you please explain this to me? And then you go into the classroom or you go into the lab and you start you get your pointer stick out and you start pointing at everything that's on the board and you say this goes to this, or maybe you got the it's Always Sunny meme with Charlie standing in front of his board with all the strings and the pins and everything, and he's like, conspiracy, man. Like, that's kind of what this thing is. It feels a little bit like a conspiracy against your brain. But it's also a giant frog. And what could be cooler than winning with a giant frog that doesn't even attack you? It just sits there and croaks at you a bunch of times. Like, I don't know. I think that's pretty awesome. So, that's a little bit of the Gitrog Monster. I, uh, to me, there are multiple directions that you can bend this strategy, but winning through the combination of pieces that take advantage of Gitrog having a really unique ability to draw cards when lands go to your graveyard is pretty cool. Thank you to everybody for watching this video. Again, I also really appreciate more submissions from our community. And I've gotten some more, so I'm excited to be able to get to some more decks this week and kind of show those off and talk about what they do. And by all means, feel free to continue to send in submissions and talk a little bit about the decks that you play and what they do and what you love about them. Thank you for watching. I love you all, and I hope you have a beautiful, wonderful rest of the day. Peace.